One last question before we kick off for the Concordia team. Do we know how many folks are viewing or have tuned in?
It sort of varies from time to time, and actually it's funny, a lot of times the viewership jumps a lot when we post it after the fact, because we record this and then we put it out on all our channels. And so but we can share with you actually a lot of analytics on this after the event for sure.
Yeah, same with us at Socrates. We may get 100 people watching and 3,000 that will watch it on YouTube over 3 weeks. Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and get started. It's 2 o'clock. We like to start on time, end on time, all the above at Concordia. My name is Matthew Swift. I'm the co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Concordia, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And as people come in and join us throughout the conversation, we're looking forward to an engaging and important discussion on opportunity zones and impact investing. I've got to say, a timely conversation, an important discussion, especially as we think about, the hopeful positive news on the vaccine front and where we go from here. Impact investing and opportunity zones are going to be more relevant than ever before when it comes to empowering communities, improving communities. And so I'm so excited on behalf of everybody at Concordia, our leadership council and board of directors, that we are talking about this issue. And I will guarantee here that this is not just the first conversation we are going to be having about this. This is really part of a series. So thank you so much to everybody for joining Concordia Live today, and looking forward to hearing from all of our participants. A couple quick housekeeping things before I pass it over to my good friend Cordell, but we have a live Q&A portion at the end of the discussion. And so to ask a question during Q&A, please utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So if you are a viewer, you will see a Q&A button there, and that is where to submit any questions that you have. This webinar is recorded. And is going to be available on our website, www.concordia.net, and our YouTube channel. And the Q&A portion will actually not be recorded. That is a member-specific only benefit, and is something that only members can do at Concordia. And our membership community is very, very much at the heart of everything we do here. So without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce today's moderator, who is a friend and also esteemed colleague, Cordell Carter. Cordell leads the Aspen Institute Socrates program as its executive director. I have been fortunate to participate in 2 Socrates weekends, and so for those of you that don't know about it, please look that up. It's an amazing program he runs. It's really a thought-provoking education forum for emerging leaders, and I myself have really benefited from those weekends that Cordell has curated. Cordell also runs his own leadership consulting firm and does also serve as an advisor to Concordia. On top of all of that, Cordell was also, we partnered together to open the 10th Concordia Annual Summit this past September, talking about an issue that brings no controversy at all, which was U.S. politics, and that was the opening block to which Cordell and I hosted, and it was a great pleasure. So I'm always honored to do anything with Cordell Carter. So Cordell, off to you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's really my honor to be associated with you and Concordia. You and your team are doing amazing work, and in our incoming new political leadership, I think there's a huge role for Concordia to continue to play around the world, not just in USA. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have a fantastic panel. We are all over the United States. I'm coming to you from the Washington, D.C. area. We have 3 impact investors, one in Florida, one in Cleveland, Ohio, and one in Newark, New Jersey. So representing some very diverse locations and very diverse perspectives on impact investing, specifically as it relates to opportunity zones. And so I'm going to ask each of our panelists in the following order: Howard Buffett, Sandy Castor, and Marcus Martin, to talk about their work and their approach towards impact investing. Let's start with our dear professor, Mr. Howard Buffett.
Cordell, thank you so much. I may be sitting in Florida today, but I'm a through and through Nebraskan, so that's kind of a little bit of the center of the country being represented on the panel, I hope.
That's the dead center.
Well. Yeah, dead. Yeah, exactly. Right, yes. Right there. So it's first of all, it's an honor to join the panel. Thank you to our hosts. Thank you, Cordell, as a moderator, and also to the other panelists. You know you're in good company when you're the least impressive person on a panel. So I look forward to learning from the others who are joining us today. Cordell, you asked about our work related to impact investing. You know, I feel like I've been focused on the impact sector pretty broadly for most of my life. Career-wise, I've had the opportunity to engage in impact-related work from a number of diverse vantage points. In the philanthropic sector, I've had the opportunity to work with some large family foundations. I was at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for a special projects team there focused on the quality of impact assessments. And then later I was the executive director of our Families Foundation, where we work to improve the quality of life and the standard of living for marginalized and impoverished populations all over the world. So those are really deep and meaningful philanthropic engagements that I was able to participate in. At a different time in my career in the public sector, I worked in the White House for the Domestic Policy Council and co-authored the President's Cross-Sector Partnership Strategy. And we'll talk a little bit about cross-sector partnerships later, I think, in the panel. And also worked on the administration's impact economy position paper, which was really an exciting time, 2009, 2010, to be focusing on this, really when there was a lot of energy picking up around it. And then later I served in the Department of Defense, and I led a few impact initiatives in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And those were, by pure definition, very, very high impact. And a really good blending of both philanthropic and private and public sector capital all coming together to achieve certain objectives. Now, speaking of the private sector, more recently I sit on a couple of corporate boards. I focus a lot on sustainability and ESG strategies. And this is in a lot of areas, manufacturing, food, agriculture, genetics, technology platform as well, really interesting one here in Florida. And then I also make some direct impact investments as well. So like I said, it's very diverse. It's over the last 20 years of work I've been doing. But related to Opportunity Zones specifically is my work as a professor and research scholar at Columbia University, what you had referenced, Cordell. And in this capacity, my research really focuses on market failures in capital flows to economically distressed communities. And so obviously that's relevant for most Opportunity Zones. It's also relevant for frontier and emerging economies as well. And the fact that there are market failures is both unsurprising on one hand, because we have a lot of economic turmoil. Feels like endless uncertainty. We've got a global pandemic going on. But on the other hand, it's also a little bit surprising because there's been ongoing signaling for years now among US capital markets and investors who wish to combine social and financial returns in their investments. We're seeing this grow significantly across all investor types. And so the question that we focus on at Columbia is, why is there this supply-demand gap? And we've really found three impediments. I'll tell you these and then I'll be quiet because I know we've got everyone else to get through. So, but mainly, first, we find that investors need to better understand the form, function, risk, and utility associated with socially oriented financing vehicles. So these could be qualified Opportunity Zone funds, could be social impact bonds, could be first loss capital tools, hybrid grants, or other types of blended finance. So there's a need there. Two is that social entrepreneurs need better tools and training to access additional funding opportunities. So when there's a supply of that capital that's out there, and there's some bottlenecks in terms of how to get the capital flowing, then we actually need where the demand is taking place to connect with that. And then the third problem, which brings all this together, is a problem of information asymmetry. And this is between the investors who will prioritize social returns with their investments. And of course, by social, I mean social, environmental, economic, and others. And then project managers and social entrepreneurs who are really struggling to provide adequate measurable social performance results to those capital allocators. And I'll just close by saying that taking all of that and applying it specifically to OZs, what we've been able to do is convene a number of different workshops on the topic, do some executive education courses, have guest speakers come in, work with the students, work with others. And then we've published a number of reports and findings as well. We've done a whole landscaping on tools that are useful for OZs and OZ developers, depending on what phase of development you're in. And I'm happy to share a link to that microsite where we've got all that research published, and I'll do it in the chat box in just a little bit.
Fantastic. Thank you, Howard. Sandy, so good to see you.
So good to see you. I'm so excited to be here on this panel with Howard and Marcus, and thank you, Cordell, for inviting me to the conversation. my experience has really started from a grassroots perspective. So someone who, I like to call myself a retired political operative, but I would like to say you're never really retired from that profession. It always calls you back. And I feel like this election has been no different, right? Because for me, it's always about the community, and it's making sure that the community is heard and that their benefits are represented at the table, regardless of party. So that's really been the lens from which I've done my work. I've had the opportunity to be in both, not in both, but I'd like to say I've had the opportunity to be in various different sectors. So I've worked in the private sector, which is currently where I'm seated right now, working with investors to deploy resources to real estate development opportunities in Newark, New Jersey. But prior to that, I was in the philanthropic sector. And then prior to that, I was in the public sector. But in all of those sectors, I'm interfacing with the nonprofit community, right? So, and for anything to happen, for you to have the type of intel as to what is happening in different communities, I feel it's tremendously important to be partnered with a nonprofit, to be aware of the different associations, from tenant associations to, the most prominent high school. That's how you find out what the community really needs. That's how you find out how you can best deploy your assets and resources to get that impact that Howard, you had referenced before. That's measurable outcomes, right? That investors want to see. So that's by and large how I've been able to bring all of those different experiences that I've had in my career to where I am right now at Baldwin Equities, where my primary focus is structuring deals between nonprofit entities and for-profit entities such as myself to bring about that type of community benefit that many municipalities, and I think the reason why opportunity zones were created, right? I think that it's an incentive to do what has already been done or has already been underway to some capacity and lend it more capital and resources for it to continue to grow. What I'm most excited about in this conversation is to, be able to dig deeper. The real estate piece is always going to keep moving because I feel like real estate is much like air. You need air to breathe and you're going to need shelter. So the real estate, it'll have ebbs and flows, right? But the real estate market was one of the first markets within the opportunity zone to actually hit its stride. I think post-pandemic, what I'm really most excited to see when it comes to opportunity zones is how do we leverage the business piece, investment into businesses, in particular small businesses, because I think those are going to be the economic engines that get this country back on track. So that's what I am really focused on in creating opportunities in real estate, also creating indirect opportunities with small businesses in terms of providing that equity and that experience, right? Because there's also that experience piece, I think that Howard, you also touched on, that many of the developers, many of our small tradespeople are looking for, so that way they can begin to build their business and they can continue to be positive contributors to the communities that they reside within or want to improve. So that's a little bit about me. I view all the work that I do from a campaign lens, where right now my candidate is the disenfranchised, underserved communities, and I'm advocating for them through my work.
Great, thank you. Now on to Cleveland's finest, Marcus Martin, a lead partner at the Fulcrum Fund. Please tell us what's going on in Cleveland and what the Fulcrum Fund does with impact investing.
Well, what's going on in Cleveland is we're finally uncovering from all the snow that we got a few days ago, which is not too atypical from the Cleveland area. But first and foremost, thank you, Cordell, for having me. I'm so pleased to be on this panel with Howard and Sandy, and quite honestly, pretty humbled to be a part of this. So I think the Fulcrum Fund, building off of what Sandy was talking about, our focus is the business side of the equation and investing in businesses that are minority led, that are oftentimes in urban centers, that are very much going to overlap with the opportunity zones. And, our perspective is we're using private equity as a tool to help drive improvement in these local economies by investing in these small businesses, and then by extension of investing in those small businesses and growing the ecosystems around them, right? So that's very important to what we believe. And by way of background, so my entire career, I have been in the private sector, but it has always been with a tilt towards either philanthropic or small business for the most part. So even my first job when I joined McKinsey right out of school, one of my first engagements was the Bush Clinton Katrina Fund, because it was back in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina had devastated the Gulf Coast area, and being able to raise my hand and go on there and see how can you allocate dollars to help a community that was devastated, that was already, in a fairly impoverished situation. I mean, that left a lasting impression on kind of the rest of the work that I wanted to do. And so as I've kind of matriculated over the years, I've either been at private equity firms where we were investing in small business or lower middle market companies, really focused on growth and trying to grow them, as opposed to, kind of dismantling and financially engineering an outcome. Or I even did a stint at a bank where, the local bank here in Cleveland, Key Bank, where I led our entire small business division, trying to figure out how can we, as a bank, provide the right tools and products and assets to help position those companies to grow. So I am a huge believer that if we drive our small business community better, we will have a better country, a better economy, and all that. I think it drives from that. So really, really excited to talk about that. And again, now with this new opportunity with Fulcrum, where we're raising this $250 million fund to invest directly into these communities and buy these companies, I think it finally gives us an opportunity to really have impact at a much larger scale than what's ever been presented before.
Great. That and bringing together these public-private partnerships that Howard referenced earlier for your greater good. I want to kind of step back a second, because I realize that we didn't define opportunity zones, and I'll define it with a phrase, which is pretty rare these days of our current administration. It was after all the Trump administration that, with the help of Senators Scott from South Carolina and Senator Booker from New Jersey, that put the opportunity zone legislation as part of the tax cut of 2018, I believe. And so that it literally created just tremendous market opportunity. And that is why we're here today. So I want, for the record, that we are all, Cordell, praising the current administration for that particular piece of legislation, because I do believe it's going to move people out of poverty and create lots of opportunity. But let's go specific on that. Sandy, you've been working in opportunity zones for a while now. Could you tell us about some projects in the Newark area that you care to highlight?
God, there are so many, I feel, because Newark has been uniquely positioned for a myriad of reasons. I mean, I personally have I feel like a love story with Newark. My first job was in Newark as a teenager. And I've seen Newark evolve over the 20 plus years with each successive leader, from Cory Booker to our current mayor, Mayor Ras Baraka. And I start with Cory because that's when I first entered the state. Actually, Sharp James was the first mayor that I worked when I was working in Newark, was the first mayor that I had the opportunity to understand his administration, followed by Cory Booker, and now followed by Mayor Ras Baraka. Newark is seeing a 6.8% of the opportunity zone assets are actually being sought after. That compared to the state overall is at 5.9%. So Newark is the place to invest at this point in time when it comes to opportunity zones. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One I'd like to highlight is the Amazon effect. As you may all know, Newark was shortlisted on the Amazon list. There was a lot of earned media that came from that. And we took that as an opportunity to highlight, and when I say we, I really mean Aisha Glover, who's currently with Audible now, overseeing a lot of their urban investments that they're looking to make from that vantage point. During her tenure, we were able to talk about the dark fiber that we had. We were able to talk about the infrastructure. We were able to talk about the relationships that we had on the state level to continue to push the agenda. Because I think a part of what makes projects successful, especially on the local level, is the relationship between the state and local municipalities from a policy perspective. And so that is what's uniquely positioned, I feel, Newark to be a place where you want to come and do business. Second, so that just sets the stage for why Newark, I feel, is a popular place to be. Some of the projects that are underway, one that I had the opportunity to work in coordinating is the Fairmont Commons project, which is currently out for an RFP. That is squarely situated within a opportunity zone. And that is a project that is about 2 square blocks within Newark's West Ward. And that project requires an early childhood center of a certain square footage to be placed. So that intentionality in the planning process is what I feel is a measurable outcome of the type of impact that when you have the partnership between policy and investment, that I think is what opportunity zones were created to do. Then there's also another project that is currently under construction between L&M and Irby. Irby has built 3 buildings within Newark's urban centers. I think Jersey City, Harrison, and Newark being their 3rd location. They're doing that in partnership with L&M. That project is slated to be completed by spring of 2022. And it's a $91.5 million project, $61.5 million of which is construction loan, and I believe another $20 million is up from the Opportunity Zone Fund that L&M and Irby have created. So that is once again another direct investment. It's L&M doubling down on their mission that they selected Newark as their home. This is a long-term investment, right? So that's again offering. It's demonstrating the partnership that can happen, and the fact that you can kind of double down, extend, broaden, grow when you leverage opportunity zones in that way. And there's so many others to talk about, but those are the 2 that are top of mind and a priority right now, I think, for the city of Newark, because it demonstrates our desire to not only look at the central business district, which I think everyone is pretty much focused on central business districts, but also taking a hard look at the neighborhood. And again, partnership with the state and local government is what's making that possible. And the policies and the conversations that we're able to have between the philanthropic, private, and public sector is what's making it all possible.
Great. Just a quick follow-up, Sandy.
Yes.
As part of the requirements that the city is putting in these RFPs, is job creation one of them?
Job creation is definitely one of them, and thank you, Cordell, for highlighting that, because in the RFP, and in the pre-conference call that I was able to participate in, it is very clear, and the city makes no apologies for it, and I'm grateful for the leadership for making this a priority. But it's a priority for not only local builders to be a part of the project, but local tradespeople to be a part of the project. What type of indirect and direct jobs are you going to be creating by taking on both the commercial and residential infills? Because the project has 3 commercial sites. Then it also has about, I want to say, possibility for over 75 new units to be created, and which would be an ownership opportunity for a number of Newark residents. Again, a priority of the administration. They are very unapologetic in that approach and making sure that Newark residents benefit from the type of investment that is taking place in Newark. The mayor firmly believes, in my opinion, in that all boats will rise with this tide, and they're making policy to make sure that that takes place.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, Marcus, you are on a purchasing spree, and I just wonder, from your vantage point as one of the lead partners for Fulcrum, what are you seeing? Do you anticipate more or less business as you purchase things in opportunity zones, or is that not your target? What's going on from your vantage point?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So it's no secret that COVID has obviously had a significant impact on businesses more broadly, but like many things, that impact has been exacerbated in the minority community. So minority business owners have been disproportionately impacted by the effects of COVID more so. And so for us, many will see that as a challenge. We see that as an opportunity. Not to play off the opportunity zone word that often, but we believe that creates even more of a need for us to be more active and for us to drive more growth in these businesses. And so from Fulcrum's perspective, our goal will be to acquire anywhere from 12 to 15 companies as anchor institutions is what we call them over the next kind of 5 to 6 years, right? And the goal with each of those is to expand the ecosystems around those. And each of those companies will be located in and around opportunity zones areas. And so our belief is it's kind of threefold. So you have us coming in with our strategic and operational expertise to help drive growth, provide education, really focusing on 2 key metrics outside of the returns, which is, are we able to drive net new worth of the minority owners that we're investing in of at least $10 million, right? So that is meaningful dollars. It is a goal of ours. The other metric that we're going to be tracking very closely is jobs, right? Are we adding jobs? And so that's the fulcrum piece of it. But then you have our partner Minority Wealth Commission, right? With Cordell, which you would be familiar with, that's bringing all of these other institutions together who are focused on how do we shrink the wealth gap, the minority wealth gap in this country, that are partnering with us when we go into these ecosystems to provide additional services to each of these markets. And then the third element, which we're really excited about, and is also really unique to any other model that we've seen, at least out there, is this concept of fulcrum freedom. And what fulcrum freedom allows is it allows nonprofits and other organizations in those markets where we've invested in the companies to then collect dollars and invest alongside of us. So now, as we grow those institutions inside of those markets and we generate returns, a portion of those returns end up going right back into the community where we invested. And I think, again, it's in all of my years of being in private equity and investing, I've not seen vehicles work this way. I'll finish with this. Other things that we're doing that we also believe will kind of trickle down effect, if you will, within these ecosystems. When we're investing in these companies, we are making it a goal of ours to try and drive towards 100% diversity spend for those companies. It is a large, bombastic goal, and maybe we don't achieve it, but it is a focus of ours. So if I go into a community and we've got to, we'll need to have a janitorial supply company come in and do our office work. Well, you know what? Is there a minority-led janitorial supply company there? Is there a minority-led office supply company? What about your accountants or your banks and things like that? So we will make it a part of our due diligence process to lay all of that out before we even close on the deal, so that we know kind of going forward day one that we're able to drive incremental contracts to these other minority companies that we have not even invested in, which will grow the wealth. It will make that market more attractable. It hopefully drives real estate values. Like there's just numerous benefits that we believe can be created by being very targeted in how we do our investing.
It sounds like you're not buying companies, you're buying supply chains.
I mean, it's an interesting way to think about it. I mean, it's certainly, we certainly are buying companies, but we believe that just because you invest in one company doesn't mean you can't have impact in many others around that, I guess is the way to think about it.
Yeah, it's like a super impact fund, like very, very intentional. What type, if you don't mind me asking, what type of people are investing in your fund as you do the fundraise?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So maybe let me back up and give some of the unique characteristics of the fund. So in a typical private equity fund, you have traditional LPs or limited partners, and these are institutional investors, high net worth individuals, family offices of the like, and they're typically investing with a hope of generating, a great return, obviously, right? And at which point, we get paid off of a portion of that return. What's unique about how our fund is structured is we actually have two classes of shares. So we have a Class A and a Class B, and we qualify as a CRA fund. And so that allows banks to come in who want to use CRA investment dollars. So our Class A has a fixed return of 4%. And then our Class B is more of that traditional LP investment base. And so the unique thing about that is we kind of get to leverage. We have kind of built-in leverage in our fund. So we're able to deliver on the goals of the banks who want to have the CRA investment dollars, but then we're also able to help increase the amount of return, the rate of return for our traditional LPs as well. And so we've had commitments from a couple of banks already. We've got obviously high net worth individuals from our networks that have gotten involved. And every day we're out trying to finish up the raise, if you will.
Fantastic. And as I tell everyone with a leading practice, document. There'll be a great case study for folks like Howard Buffett to teach on. Howard, please talk to us about some models that lead success with respect to social value investing. I know that's something you've studied at Columbia.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thank you so much. And a perfect segue. So the first thing I'll say is just hearing some of the great examples from the other panelists. I know of a lot of the work that's going on in Erie, Pennsylvania with the flagship opportunity zone there. Also, the Kingdom Impact Group is doing really great work in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, but also more recently now in Nashville, Tennessee. And so I just thought I'd kind of put a pin in those for a moment. But instead of diving into the particular cases, because you just heard so much great information, I want to first discuss what you mentioned, Cordell, which is a broader model, which I think can help make opportunity zones successful. And that is the model I mentioned earlier of a cross-sector partnership. Now, I know there's a lot of folks who are probably listening and that know what cross-sector partnerships are. I know I have some former students and friends of mine who are listening in, so they know this better than probably even I do. But if you're not familiar, cross-sector partnerships happen when organizations from 2 or more sectors, frequently 3 sectors, leverage their respective teams and resources to achieve mutually agreed upon and measurable goals. Or very simply put, when the outcome of multiple organizations' coordinated actions is greater than the sum of its parts. And Cordell, you mentioned social value investing. That's the title of a book I published in 2018, and it really focuses deeply on cross-sector partnerships specifically. And in this book, which I'm not necessarily recommending for anyone, it's an academic book, so if you need help falling asleep at night, then you should get a copy, but otherwise don't. In the book, we go through a lot of success stories where community organizers and foundation heads and CEOs and public servants have all come together to accomplish something significant and good for society, and specifically something they couldn't achieve on their own. And we have a lot of case studies in the book. They range from Central Park in New York City to poverty reduction in Afghanistan to improved city services in Brazil and a bunch of others. And we have documentaries online as well and everything else. And through this, what we do is we look at these case studies and then we try to provide a playbook for how people could replicate the success for other cross-sector partnerships. And I mention all this because it's perfectly relevant to opportunity zones. And based on the background I just gave you, I want to highlight some patterns that we have seen in promising OZs, and they're very similar patterns that we see in cross-sector partnerships. It's a direct overlap. And so really, I'll run through what this is. There are 5 elements that we'll see in place with these successful developments. And when we see all 5 of these present, it's typically because all 3 kind of primary stakeholder groups are working well together. So it's the developers or investors, it's the local community and community-based organizations and individuals, and then it's both the local and the state municipalities, as Sandy was mentioning earlier. And all 3 of those groups, in different forms and different makeups depending on the community, they all work collaboratively very effectively. You see the success coming out. And so really the 5 elements or ingredients to that is that those groups will have a well thought out and developed process in place for effective cooperation. And generally, this will speak to how these organizations operate and how they collaborate with each other in the development, investment, and planning process. The second is that the respective organizations and communities, but specifically the organizations working to bring about change, will ensure that they have the capacity and the talent that they need in their people that they can draw from for effective community development. And an important question to ask there is, how do the people across these teams collaborate during this process? So you have a process in place, you know who your collaborators are, and then how do you get the teams built out effectively to make sure the right skill sets are represented across a kind of a number of different skills-based capital? And then how do you actually make sure they're working well together? So that's number 2. Number 3 is the importance of place-based investment here. So opportunities are place-based by definition. In 2010, the Obama administration, at least in the Domestic Policy Council, put out a pretty significant memo outlining the importance for a lot of federal agencies to shift to a place-based investment perspective. And it's so important because you're coordinating the resources of a diverse group of actors all towards common goals. And really things have to be place-based to bring about lasting change. So OZs are taking place in a particular community. And what you have to consider here is whether or not the development strategy, so what the developers and investors are bringing in, is really effectively tailored to that place and to the specific preferences and priorities of the stakeholders, and specifically that community. And we heard an example of this, I think, when Sandy was talking about in Newark about kind of focus on early childhood education, right? A clear need that the community had and a response to that as part of the development strategy. The fourth, and don't worry, there's only 5. The fourth is really about resources. And it's whether or not there is a sufficient portfolio of resources available and in place to support the ongoing process. So we know what the process is, we know who the people are and the teams and how they work together, we know what the community needs and priorities are and how that gets integrated into planning and decision making. Now, do we have the right resources to do this? And as you heard Marcus mention earlier, sometimes that means bringing in different kinds of capital. It can be beyond just private investment, right? And then fifth, and what I get most excited about is on performance measurement and management. So how do partners know that they've defined success correctly? Has the community been involved in that process? And then how do they know when they actually achieve success? And again, you heard some examples with our last speaker on how Marcus has defined some of their success metrics. He talked about wealth creation, about jobs, and then the focus on diversity, which is critically important. And so those would be elements that would go into your performance measurement. And frequently I get asked from a lot of organizations about this, which is, do we have the right measurement and reporting models in place? And so I spent a lot of time on this topic. I've developed a measurement system. It's called Impact Rate of Return. And if we have time later in the panel, I want to share a little bit more about that because I think it's relevant for investors.
Well, given that I'm looking at some of the questions and it's all about transparency and measurement, if you wouldn't mind maybe giving us a quick overview of this index that you've come up with, and I think it's really relevant to our questions.
Okay, so more than happy to do that. Although, you know what, I'm going to take a small step back because I've looked at some of the questions that are coming through too. I know Hillary put one in about accountability. And a lot of people it's very active. And so I think I'm going to answer this in 2 parts if it's okay, Cordell.
That's fine.
And bear with me for a minute because I have to work through this, which is first, there's clear potential for opportunity zones to be doing well. The other panelists have commented on this as well. Cordell, you agree with this too, to bring about great positive community change. And what I've come across in the research I've done, the interviews I've done, there are a lot of observations about how things can get improved. And there's 4 of them, the 4th which gets into measurement and transparency. But the first couple have to do with the legislation itself. And I think the first one is not a surprise to anyone, which is that there could have been tighter requirements around what does and does not qualify as an opportunity zone. Now, when we've seen a lot of the negative press around this, and Sandy, I think, references too, around kind of both getting positive and negative attention to these things, it's really been around that particular thing. And the thing that's been so frustrating with me around kind of media coverage has been a lot of reporters who take a very negative view and first don't offer any solutions, and secondly hone in on a very narrow aspects of what has gone wrong and pick out kind of the few bad apples among an entire orchard of potential. And then even beyond that, and then I'll get off my soapbox, is folks who are demanding the fact that there isn't change happening fast enough, and this has been around for a couple of years now, and how come all communities aren't lifted out of poverty by now, which is just completely unrealistic, of course. And we're only starting to see investment dollars really meaningfully flow into these funds as well because of the timing requirements and everything else. So that's kind of number 1. Number 2, Cordell, you'll regret having asked me to speak twice in a row, is to really require community engagement. And if the legislation had done that, or if upcoming administrative requirements push for that, then you can get kind of a flexible but meaningful way communities are involved in the way that the investment dollars are going into these OZs. The third is probably the most controversial, which is that I have heard folks discuss that tax incentives should be tied to impact performance. This is getting a little bit closer to the transparency question. Now, there's usually a very clear division on opinions regarding this point, which is no, that shouldn't happen, or yes, that would be phenomenal. And very few people say, maybe. It's usually you're one side or the other. And with this, one of the biggest complaints I see around not tying performance to incentives is the fact that a lot of investors say, well, how do we even measure impact? Where do we go from there, and how do we kind of have a consistent way of doing that? So that's kind of the fourth piece of this, which is that if we could have ways to harmonize metrics, analysis, and reporting, then we would be a lot further along in this, and particularly if it's being mandated or if it's at least being strongly encouraged or rewarded, right? And so we've got some efforts that have done this, the OZ reporting guidelines from the Beak Center at Georgetown and from the New York Federal Reserve Bank and the Impact Investing Alliance and others. And so there's progress being made, but if I can, either I can pause here, but I'd like to get into why this is important.
Please do. Please do.
You're sure? Okay, because okay, so I'll keep going on this, and then I'll be quiet for the whole rest of the panel. So why is this important? Well, one, getting the right metrics and measurement systems in place is an incredibly good way to engage community, and it's rarely ever done. So that means sitting down with community members and actually asking them, how do you want us to measure success, right? We know we have our financial returns, we have some ideas around impact returns, jobs, wealth, diversity, right, other things, but actually asking the community to participate in that process. That's one. Two is that impact reporting and analysis may be required in our new administration, right? We don't know for sure, but there's been a lot of talks about that, and there's legislation and other bills up front that, are discussing this. And then third is that measurement systems really have to be designed well from the outset. And you can't really recreate or rediscover impact data after the fact, particularly if it's years later. It's kind of capture it when you can, or it's gone in a lot of cases. And so a common question I hear from organizations is, how do we know if our programs are high impact, and what data goes into our analysis and supporting our evidence base? And with that, those questions really center around the metrics that organizations are using, the data that organizations have access to, right? And that's where organizations struggle the most. It's hard to get data, it's time consuming, it's costly, it's complex, everything else. And then how organizations analyze that information. And this is where I'll spend my last minute on this topic. So what I've been working on for a few years now is trying to address this information asymmetry challenge, right? So how do we take impact data that we're actually getting now that we know what we're measuring and inform our actions with it? And the approach is something I mentioned earlier, impact rate of return. And it's really designed to help organizations, particularly in opportunity zones, but any kind of organizations, analyze and report on impact of any kind. And they do this by looking across 5 key attributes of impact. The first is the type of impact that they're trying to deliver. We've heard examples of this from our past speakers of kind of where this is taking place already. So how is change being delivered? The second is the quantity of impact. So what's the magnitude of change being delivered? Now that we've defined the kind of change we want, how much are we actually doing? The third, which is probably the most important in this overall equation, is the quality of impact. So how meaningful is that change? The fourth is the cost of impact. And so we need to understand how cost effective we are in developing how our different projects are making our investments in our communities, right? So if it's an investment or a grant or whatever it is. And then fifth and final aspect of this is time. So the time of impact. So how long does it take to actually deliver that change that you've set out to do, and the amount of time that you're going to do it, the cost you've set out, the quality you want to do, and the magnitude. And so organizations really have to bring a comprehensive perspective of all 5 of these attributes. And when they do so, it provides a really remarkable set of results, because you can divide a project's expected or delivered quantity of impact by its quality, cost effectiveness, and the amount of time required. And what that does is it actually gives you a rate of impact, right? Impact rate of return. And so for every dollar you're putting out, you can see how much impact you're getting in response, essentially. So again, I could go into more detail on each of those 5 elements if folks have interest in the Q&A, but again, I'm not going to spend more time on it, but the objective here is that it's a system, it's rigorous, but it's not too onerous. And in the end, what it's really hoping to do is help investors become more effective in how they engage communities and how they conduct development in opportunity zones. So I'll pause there, but thank you, Cordell.
Thank you. And I know you dropped a link to your body of research at Columbia, but you might want to drop a link to the book as well.
Yeah, perfect. I'll do that.
Harder conversation. So my last big set of questions, if you will, I'll start with Sandy, then go to Marcus, and then end with you, Howard. What advice do you have for investors seeking impact and return across the U.S., Sandy?
That is a very loaded question. I feel so many thoughts now after listening to Howard and listening to Marcus. So it's, for me, it goes beyond just the investors, right? Because as someone who's sitting on the investor side, it's very clear what we want. We want a return on investment, period, full stop. We can say, and I can pontificate for hours about how it's important to acknowledge the double bottom line, the triple bottom line. But the reality is the priority first and foremost for investors is going to be the return on investment. So that's that. Now, a part of the work that I do is really the community engagement, community benefits piece. That really comes from partnerships between the public sector and the nonprofit sector. And oftentimes the nonprofit sector, and something that Howard, you stated that I had to write down and circle like several times, was capacity and talent, right? So on the local level and within nonprofits, you'll notice that sometimes the capacity isn't there, or the ability to keep talent that has been advocating and pushing the agenda and the policy that's needed for the opportunity zones to be of benefit to the communities that it was originally designed for as per the legislation, that becomes challenging. And that's where I sometimes want to challenge, not investors per se, but the philanthropic community, to be that bridge funding, that gap funding, for lack of a better word, to help to build that capacity, to offer that type of resources, whether it be in dollars and cents or human capital. Because sometimes, and I'll highlight Prudential Foundation, one of the things that I love that they do is they offer some of their human capital to certain nonprofits to help build their capacity, whether it's from a strategic planning initiative or just making sure that they have a deep understanding of what the impacts of opportunity zones or any other type of policy that might impact the work that they're trying to do. So the advice that I really have is for the people who have the wherewithal, investors in the philanthropic community, to really take a look at how they're investing their dollars to make sure that the type of community benefit that we are requiring is met. And I look forward to the Q&A because I've got thoughts on metrics and, the standardization of those metrics and the type of questions that you're asking. Because in order for you to really have that accurate data to be able to dig deeper into the impact rate of return, I think the metrics across the board on nationally need to be the same, and the type of data that we are requiring needs to be the same, because it may not be I don't want it to be an apples to oranges situation, because some people would argue that not every opportunity was created the same, because not every state used the same type of methodology to select the tracks. I can speak very intelligently to the track selection because a colleague of mine, Ty Cooper, who's currently with NGEDA, she led that. And I know that it was very thoughtful. I know that there was conversations on a local level, on a county level, in terms of what are the distressed areas that need that help. So it wasn't just all downtown sectors. There were parts that were carved out in other neighborhoods that were in the neighborhood, right? Because in the neighborhood is where you need to see the stability created from a home ownership perspective, from a rental. When you've got a city like Newark that is 75 to 76% rental, and when every indicator from an economics perspective is telling you that ownership is the key to creating that type of stability in a market, well, Newark's at 70%, 76% renters. How do we change that? And I think opportunity zones could be that, but it's going to require, like I mentioned before, that the type of investment in the nonprofits that have been doing this work for decades. It's going to require some type of capacity building within the municipalities to continue to, because as the business comes, right, the process can be long, and then that discourages investment. So you need the resources on the local level as well. So investors, I'm not saying to be scared of cities like Newark or cities that has some work to be done. I'm saying that you need to be willing to invest in the partners that are at the table that have been doing the work and have patience. So be a patient investor. I'm hoping that with this new administration that they take a look at potentially extend beyond 2026, because quite frankly, it wasn't until December 2019 that the regulations were finalized. So that's when people got a little bit more comfortable with the thought process of investing. So I'm hoping those conversations are taking place, because then we might be able to see the type of investment and be able to put some of these transparency guidelines in place so we can truly measure the impact.
Thank you. Now, Marcus, this question essentially is your pitch to investors. So I'm not asking you to give away the secret sauce, but perhaps you can shed some light on your approach to other potential impact investors as they seek to do the type of things that Fulcrum is doing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like, how do I answer this question and not make it a commercial pitch for Fulcrum as well? And maybe I should take advantage of the platform that I'm being given a little bit too. But look, I echo a lot of what Sandy said, from being patient to having a focus of what you're looking for, to putting those dollars with individuals who have demonstrated that they have capabilities and a track record behind it. And so, because there's what we're seeing in the market right now is there is just a huge opportunity that's there. And with opportunity, you see a bunch of players come into the market and flood the market, everybody trying to get their piece of that opportunity. And so from an investor standpoint, if I put my investor hat on, I feel like you have to be even more diligent and looking at, try to say what type of impact do you want to have and what matters to you. B, look at those groups who claim to be able to deliver upon the impact that you're claim to be interested in. And then C, of those, who is really credible? And credibility, I think, comes in a few different ways, right? So one, do they have the requisite experience and track record to say that what they want to do, they've actually done before or have tried to do before? I think credibility comes to, do they have metrics, as Howard mentioned and Sandy talked about, and what are those metrics? Do those metrics align with the impact that you're trying to have? And can they clearly define how they're measuring it? And then, from our standpoint, we really focus on, you'll hear us say this over and over again, the type of investing that we do is having impact meet alpha, right? So as private equity guys, first and foremost, our goal is to drive returns. Now, we believe that it's driving returns, like what's good for our investors ultimately will be good for us, ultimately will be good for the companies that we invest in, and ultimately will be good for the communities of the companies that we invest in, right? So we try to align that entire spectrum with our strategy of when we're going to make investments. So look, at the end of the day, nobody's looking at what we're doing as like it being too altruistic. Like, it's not lost on us that when we talk to an investor, that they like the work that we're doing, they like that we're trying to have impact. But if we tell them, hey, this is not actually going to generate any returns, but it's going to make everybody feel good, we're dead on arrival, right? So we are very much focused on driving that return, but we do believe that you can do that while still having a significant impact on the world around us.
Great, thank you. Now, Howard, I'm going to switch up this question a bit for you for purely selfish reasons. Here's the scenario. Let's say you're talking to someone who curates weekend seminars all over the world for emerging leaders, just to say, as an example. And this person wants to come up with 3 themes to fill a weekend up on impact investing, but getting to the ethical dilemmas that are, and the grayness that clouds this topic for most of the general public. What would be those 3 themes you would suggest that person covers?
Wow, okay, great. It's hilarious. And I've never been asked this question before. I think one, community inclusivity, right? Incredibly important. So, my advice to any impact investors is put community first, build trust, gain support, be inclusive. And I would argue that that is sufficient enough of importance to be an entire theme to be focused on. And there's a lot that goes into that around inequity and racial issues, everything else. So there's that. 2, the next 2 aren't quite as interesting. 2 is around strategy, which I would say that to be an effective impact investor, you need to be strategic and not opportunistic when it comes to these kinds of opportunities. And that also ties into the first one by, saying you need to respect history, respect the culture of places where you're working and everything else. But how do you integrate that into a kind of a holistic approach that you're taking? And then third should be no surprise whatsoever, which is to measure, analyze, and report results on impact measurement would be the third theme. And that's around transparency, honesty, and integrity. So, honesty is being transparent with others. Integrity is being truthful to yourself. And I would argue, since you're being selfish in the question, I'll be selfish and say that session would focus on impact rate of return and how OZ investors and other impact investors can integrate that into their overall, strategic process. So I'll leave it at that. By the way, I did put a link in the chat for impact rate of return if folks want to read more about that too.
Great, thank you. I have a strong feeling that someone who fits that profile will be in touch. Great. So let's go to some of the questions. I know that Hillary's been very active in the chat and we've been responding to her questions. But David Brownstein sent a question, and I'll offer this up to the entire panel. Can you offer any examples of how OZ investments catalyze both real estate, transportation, and mobility improvements in communities? Any examples come to mind, anyone? I have one in Seattle, by the way, but so I can speak to it. So yeah, Seattle, I'm sorry, go ahead. You go ahead.
No, I was going to say I had one in San Jose, California that's under development, but not as much detail as probably what you can share.
Well, Seattle has a anti-gentrification fund that was created by Mayor Shell, I want to say 15, 20 years ago. So they were way ahead of their time. And they were building a light rail system, and all the above ground parts of the system were in your poorest parts of Seattle. And all those businesses are being displaced, really rose up. It was actually a national news because the mayor was assaulted during one of the protests, trying to speak to people. And as a result of that, the developers created a fund. And now I think they're in the 5th generation of that fund, but you have to be in that zip code, 98118, the most diverse zip code in the United States of America, to qualify for investment in the fund. So what that fund is doing now in its 5th generation is doing transportation-oriented development. They're developing on the light rail. And it's been fantastic. And you got to visit 98118 in Seattle to see some of that investment. Howard, talk about San Jose for us.
Well, yeah, San Jose is just a really remarkable kind of up-and-coming opportunity. There's a group there called Urban Community, and I think it's urbancommunity.org. And they're looking at kind of redevelopment in a corridor right next to where Google has been. And the same idea of kind of how to make sure that the connectivity on public transportation is meeting a lot of the other development investments that are going on. That's one. And then the other one is, this has been long in the making, but in downtown Omaha, where I lived in an opportunity zone right there for quite a long time, and we've been looking at doing light rail is the wrong word. It's when you have like a bus, but it's on rails. So looking at doing that and integrating that into community connectivity as well with those investments. So there are some interesting examples that are popping up in different places, like you said, Cordell.
Great, and I know, I mean, as Sandy alluded to earlier, the regulations weren't written to 2019, so it's not as much lead time because it takes the market some time to adjust to the regulations and start building a business case for it. So I know we're probably a little short on those examples. Sandy, did you have something?
Yeah, so when we were putting together a document for an accelerated program that we were looking to participate in with the city of Newark, the fascinating part, once again, to the selection process, the selection of the tracks. A lot of the tracks that were selected for Newark, New Jersey were in or around areas in which there was already an incentive for transportation investment by New Jersey, New York Port Authority. So the Seth Boyden, there was a desire to have a light rail that would take you from Newark Airport and create greater connectivity into Newark through Newark South Ward. So there is a census tract that's already been identified in that area as an opportunity zone. Now, there isn't a project yet per se that's been signed off or funded, but there's a great intentionality that was made when selection of tracks be around nodes that needed that increased investment, that catalytic investment, for lack of a better word, to get the project off the ground.
Great, and there's one more question, but we are unfortunately out of time. So Adriana, I promised to send the question directly to Sandy, and she'll respond in kind. I want to thank you, Marcus, Sandy, Howard, for giving us an hour of your December day. This has been a catalytic discussion, and I hope it leads to more of us getting involved in the type of work that you're doing. So on behalf of Concordia, thank you so much and happy holidays.
Thank you, Cordell.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.